Good afternoon, everyone. As today's talk is in conjunction with the exhibition Ever Present First Peoples Art of Australia, I would like to begin the session with an acknowledgement of country. As part of Aboriginal and nowadays Torres Strait Islander customary practice, when visiting the homelands of all country, which encompasses the land, waterways, and sky of another community, it is important to be welcomed by the traditional custodians of that place, if possible. Where this is not possible, then the visitor still needs to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country they are visiting. Acknowledgements of country allow the visitors to recognize and pay their respects to the traditional custodians to also be protected by the ancestors while visiting. As the artworks in Ever Present have traveled to Singapore, we will be acknowledging the traditional custodians of the country from which the artists came. We respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country where each First Nations artist reside or where the art in Ever Present was created. We recognize their continuing connections to country, community, and culture and pay our respect to their elders, leaders, and artists, past and present. We respectfully acknowledge all First Nations traditional custodians whose art we are currently exhibiting in Singapore. With me today are Bajala artist Dr. Fiona Foley and Yi Ilan from Sabah, Malaysia. Two artists whose works are on display in a very special trail that is part of Ever Present. This exhibition is a major survey of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander art drawn from the collections of the National Gallery of Australia as well as the Wesfarmers collection of art. This is the largest exhibition of this art to travel to this part of Asia. In addition to over 170 works that are on display in the Singtel galleries on this level, we are also presenting a trail. And the trail features works by 5 Aboriginal artists in our very own UOB Southeast Asian gallery between Declarations and Dreams. More specifically, these 5 works are each located in Southeast Asia Gallery 1, 3, 6, 12, and 14. They look at comparative histories of Southeast Asia and also the First Nation of Australia. Sometimes the parallel and the side-by-side comparison shows in a parallel manner, but at times they are punctuated as a provocation. And these provocations add to the conversation of the very narrative of our own region's modern art history. Fiona and also Ilan's works are located in the final stop of this trail. It is in SEAG 14, which is located on level 5 of the former Supreme Court wing. This section of the art, if you have visited our permanent gallery, highlights artists who are critical about art, as well as the circumstances in which the works are created within a shifting dynamics of a post-war, post-Cold War globalized moment. I would also like to take an opportunity before this talk begins to share a bit briefly about the work in which the talk is taking place currently. So we are currently within Richard Bell's embassy. The work is inspired by the first Aboriginal 10th embassy, an unofficial embassy, that is located outside of the Australia's Parliament House. First established in January 1972, the original Aboriginal 10th Embassy advocated for land rights. And since then, Aboriginal land rights have been slowly recognized through a series of legal decisions in Australia, including the landmark Mabo decision in 1992. So this year is indeed quite special for Ever Present to be here at the gallery because it also marks the 30th anniversary of the Mabo decision, as well as the 50th anniversary of the Aboriginal 10th Embassy. The banners that you see around you within this space refer to the original posters from 1972. Outside of today's talk, throughout the duration of the exhibition, 2 films, one by Alessandro Cavadini about the Australian land rights movement in 1972, as well as another film by Richard Bell, which is called Broken English, will be playing throughout the opening hours. Since Embassy was first exhibited in Melbourne in 2013, it has traveled extensively and is also currently shown at Documenta 14 in Kassel, Germany. So throughout the duration of Ever Present, Embassy is sort of a space of gathering. It is activated by a series of talks, lectures, and discussions, such as this today, where we would attempt to engage issues of concern on land rights, issues of concern about indigeneity, and also issues on rights and art. By locating the embassy within the historic space of the City Hall chamber, we also hope that the resonances between Singapore, Southeast Asia, as well as Australia are amplified and also appreciated. Now allow me to return and introduce the 2 artists. Bachala artist, Dr. Fiona Foley, is also a senior lecturer at the Queensland College of Art, Griffith University. Her recently published book, Biting the Clouds, The Aboriginal Protection and Restriction of Sales of Opium Act 1897, was awarded the Queensland Premier Award in 2021. The phrase, biting the cloud, is a euphemism for being high on opium, which was used as compensation to Aboriginal communities in exchange for their labor. Her book critically examines the history of opium addiction as well as segregation introduced through this bill. It is a subject of her research focus for decades, as well as one that is central in her PhD research. Dr. Foley's practice has tirelessly engaged with the amnesia in Australia's historiography, and we would like to hear more about that aspect in her practice in today's discussion as well. On my rightmost, Ilan, who lives and works in Kota Kinabalu, which is the Malaysian Borneo state of Sabah, is also a contemporary artist whose work, which is primarily photo media, engages with this region's history. It also addresses issues of colonization, neo-colonization. Her work looks at the lens of power and the impact of memory in the social experience. Oftentimes, these works explore a particular focus of counter-narrative of the histories from below. In 2021, Ilan was named as Art Asia Pacific Artist of the Year. Her work often employs wit and a layered visual vocabulary that draws from history, popular culture, archives, as well as everyday material and objects. She has very recently, since her relocation back to her hometown in Kota Kinabalu, started working collaboratively with sea-based and land-based communities and indigenous mediums in Sabah. So I've spoken quite a bit to give everyone a context. I would like to begin the dialogue, actually, your mics are behind you, by inviting Fiona and Ilan to speak a bit more about their works in this exhibition. So, maybe if you haven't seen, if you have not been to the exhibition, please do. But their works are actually located within our permanent galleries, which is on the other side of the wing, the former Supreme Court wing. And you will notice that the works are often marked with the ever-present logo. So their works are in Southeast Asia Gallery 14, and I'd like to invite them to speak of these 2 works, which are in dialogue. I think, firstly, Fiona Foley's Bachala Woman series stems from her research of ethnographic photographs of her people. And in particular, it's one of an unnamed woman, a young woman around the late 19th century in the John Oxley Library in Brisbane. Ilan's work, which is from the Picturing Power series, are in part archival images that are drawn from the Tropen Museum collection, an ethnographic museum founded in 1864 in Amsterdam. So I would like to begin maybe for you to just discuss how you first come across these images. What were you looking for that got you to encounter these images? And what was the impetus for you to create these works?
Hello, everyone. It's nice to be here in Singapore. So the work in the show, for me, from my perspective, is an old work from 1994. So that sort of dates me. That's me in those images. Now I've got grey hair. And it's no longer long. So I have to cast my mind back about 3 decades, I think. And the work really has come about through really my mother's work, life work, related to retrieving Butchulla cultural material from archives in Australia. So not many people would be aware that Australia did have a brutal history. That's something that most Australians and the state and federal governments are trying to come to terms with at the moment, because there were many massacres in Australia to take land off Aboriginal people, the various nations, and I come from the Wandunna clan of the Butchulla Nation, but also in amongst that was the exploitation of our natural resources, and timber was one of those from where I come from. So it was like the karri pine, hoop pine, satinay, blackbutt and bunya pines, and that devastation on the environment was quite harsh. So, for instance, when they set up the sawmilling enterprises to take out the bunya pines, that industry only lasted for 10 years because they had depleted the stocks of those magnificent bunya pines. So that just is a short indication of exploitation of our natural resources in southeast Queensland. So it meant that by the time I was born and my mother was born, there had been many successive waves of strategic aspects of colonisation, and the removal of Butchulla language from our people by the missionaries was one of those other colonialisms that we had to undergo as a people. So although I grew up in a family that was very proud to speak a remnant language, it was not full sentences, or it was just a word here and there. So my mother pieced together a word list from many archives, and in that search she would go to state museums and libraries, and in that she went to the John Oxley Library and found 4 very beautiful black and white images of my forebears, and there was a woman in amongst those 4 images, and all it said was Fraser Island woman. It had no name for her, no birth date, no death date, no information in terms of what role she played in society. And when I was 30, I decided, well, actually it's 20 odd years ago, when I was 30, I decided to recast that image of her, that Fraser Island woman, and use my body to take that image again in admiration of that black and white image. And so it was, I didn't realise it then, but it's like mining the archives to articulate a different form of Butchulla reality in contemporary art. So it's an old work, and I've done many series of photographs since then looking at my culture.
Picturing Power for me came about as a result of a workshop at the Langgeng Foundation in Yogyakarta, where I was one of 10 artists invited by photo historian Alexander Supartorno, who was doing his PhD at the time on the colonial archive of Southeast Asian societies, specifically in Java. And he was, I think, in Sunderland or Edinburgh University, where he is still. So he invited artists who use photography as opposed to the camera, which is my interest. I'm interested in the object of the photograph. And as kind of evidences, if you like, trails through a fairly modern history that comes with the history of photography. So we had thousands of images that Alex had already found at the Troppen Museum and actually National Gallery Australia as well. And as a photo historian with a focus on colonialism, he was asking us artists to look at these images with him to see what we might find, or to see what collectively or individually we might be able to mine or learn from a mass, thousands of images. And it was 10 of us, I think, over a 10-day workshop, something like that. And we sat around and we read the photograph. And it was really deeply stimulating for me to actually read an image with other people who were also reading the image. And we were trying to kind of see what we could find in that process. And what really struck me that just wouldn't let me go was the table. So in this massive realization for me, as a Sabahan who has, Singapore, my ex-country mates, right, back in the day, for a couple of years, right, without manipulation of our borders and the construction of the nation state, we are part of a constructed history, and the relationship that we in Sabah and the Borneo states of Malaysia still have with federal Malaysia is an issue, and trying to understand why we feel this anxiety. Where does it come from? Where does these feelings that just won't go away, where does it? My entire practice is about this. It's just understanding our borders and these power structures over us. So finding the table to me was, if you ask the question, how do you colonize someone? Which seems like a really straightforward question. How do you do that? With Picturing Power, through looking at thousands of these archival images from colonizers, from the colonizer's camera, was the realization that everywhere was this table. And how do you colonize someone? You colonize them through admin, through the violence of administration, through the violence of the education system, through the directives of language or loss of language, of what is defined as civilized or not civilized, what is considered precious and should be kept in a museum or what is not. The borders, all of this comes from this hard patriarchal colonial power. When you survey the land, and I tell you what the value of your land is, I tell you what the value of that timber is, that is not your value necessarily, but their extractive value. So all of this, I started seeing everything differently. And Picturing Power was a result of that light bulb moment of the violence of the table, and how invisible, in a way, or how innocuous it may seem. In Southeast Asia, we don't, historically, pre-colonial years, we did not have tables in the archipelago of Southeast Asia. The island states of Southeast Asia does not have a history of tables. Everyone sat on the mat. And in the word for table in Malay is meja. In Tagalog, in the Philippines, it's mesa. This comes from the Portuguese and Spanish word for table, which is mesa. It's a direct linguistic billboard indicator of where our tables come from. So that, to me, was a major revelation that came through a workshop environment with a photo historian, academic, to read that ethnographic photograph, like the one that you found, and how do we unpack history? How do we unpack an image? How do we find something that we can make understanding with? Yeah.
Yep. Thanks. I think it's interesting that the two of you, foregrounded this idea of the table in Ilan's work and the camera in Fiona's sort of work as tools of power. And yet these tools of power and knowledge, in a sense, have also been used in constructing a kind of history. And in a way, by sort of coming in and intervening with this, there is a way of rewriting or gazing back, if you call, but you're still using that same tool and turning that gaze around, or turning that power, upending that power. And if you look at your body of works, then like, Fiona, you also, and Ilan, you've both addressed these histories that have been written out or neglected from the sort of mainstream psyche. It's not only in Bajala Woman, but there's work of the similar time, Native Blood. You also talk about the difficult history of sexual violence in Red Ochre Me. And more recently, Horror Has a Face, that history of opium addiction. And in Ilan, you also have a work exhibited previously at the National Gallery for a different exhibition, which is the study of Lamprey Malayan man, Malayan male 1 and 2. And so these are quite interesting way of interventions, if one may put it that way. I perhaps want to invite you to reflect on that impetus. We've heard about the encounter of these two kind of historical sources, which is, the library and the museum archive. But maybe explain about why it has continued to persist, this idea of making art as a way of counter-narrative in history. Yeah, just have a discussion about that. You want to start first, Ilan or Fiona?
The body of work I did for my PhD in 2017 was titled Horror Has a Face. And I think as artists, we vibe off other people's work creatively. So Horror Has a Face is a line that Marlon Brando says in Apocalypse Now, but the original source is Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, when he's travelling the Indian upper river, I think it's in Belgium and the Congo region, and the exploitation that took place there was on a massive level and strategic in how they overthrew various African, I'll just say kingdoms or nations, and the brutality that was inflicted on people because of the wealth of that country that they wanted to exploit. So these are long histories, and Australia has a long history of doing incredible, carrying out incredible brutality against Aboriginal nations right across Australia. And before I came here, the day before, I was a part of a film that's going to be aired, a 3-part film series that's going to be aired in Australia in September and October, looking at the totality of various states and the frontier wars, which are basically massacres that took place in Australia. That's something that, as a continent, we non-Indigenous people don't like to talk about, and I've been at an APT, as Australia Pacific Triennial, where a non-Indigenous curator from the Gallery of Modern Art articulated that Australia had been settled peacefully. And it was to an audience, international audience of over 1,000 people. And at that stage, roughly, I think it was in 1999, I didn't have all of the knowledge that I've gained since then, and I deliberately set out to debunk that myth. And so I work across various genres, I don't just work in photography. So I set out to find out what on the public record is the number of massacre sites in the state, just the state alone of Queensland. And I did a public artwork called Witnessing to Silence that was commissioned by the Brisbane Magistrates Court, and I knew I had to use this opportunity, but I had to use it in silence for 2 years to have inscribed on the pavers out of the forecourt of 94 massacre sites in the state. And, you know, the work is hard-hitting. Sometimes it's beautiful, like this work here at the State Library of Queensland, where there are 777 opium poppies in the ceiling. And once again, it's these hidden histories that I'm delving into. Sometimes it's located with my own people, the Butchulla people, but sometimes it's a history that's either state or nationwide. And so why I write about that legislation and talk about opium is because they used to give opium to Aboriginal people after Europeans and Chinese had smoked the opium with pipes. They would give them the ash and Aboriginal people would mix it with water and they would addict them as a free labour force in Queensland. Now, this is a history that was prevalent in Australia. The state government was involved in issuing licences and bringing in a revenue into the state coffers every year. Everyone in Australia pleads ignorance to this history. And, you know, you get a bit tired of that because there are many Indigenous artists and there's been a cultural renaissance in Australia since the 80s with people who are performing dance, theatre, singing, visual artists, filmmakers, writers who are talking about this history. We make up 3% of the Australian population. We punch well above our weight culturally. We are trotted out internationally for important embassy events. Let's just put it like that. And but there's this ongoing ignorance where non-Indigenous Australians think it's incumbent on Aboriginal people to teach them their own history. And I have huge adversity to that because this history is not taught in our education system, and the only way that I learned about this alternative history was to read books by historians. So I'm largely self-taught. I've pieced it together over a number of decades. And I forget the original question, but that's sort of, it's a larger picture.
I have such resonance with you. In Sabah, we don't learn our history either. We learn Malayan history. So Sabah, Sarawak, and the formation of Malaysia, including Singapore, share one chapter in our entire school history syllabus. So the entire Sabah, entire Sarawak, Brunei predates the Malacca Sultanate. That's how old our history is. We invented art. The oldest cave paintings in the world are at Borneo Island in Sulawesi 40,000 years ago. I think Australian Aboriginals might argue with us, but as per found cave paintings and carbon dated, 40,000 years. And I love making that bombastic claim. Us Borneans invented the art because you never hear our voices. And as you're talking, you're talking so much about answering back, aren't you? And I think that's what I do. And that process of self-teaching or this need to be able to answer back means you have to learn, and you have to read, you have to find your sources and then gather stuff, whatever form it may take, oral storytelling or a book or whatever, purely so that you can answer back because your gut is saying, I disagree, And because we're not taught, where do we what can we grasp at to answer back? And I think that process of answering back is and making a problem, you know. I often get Ilan, stop making problem. I go, I want to make more problems, you know. I want to mess it up. I want to mess up the neatness to complicate for a richer history and a history that is, I don't think, history is used all the time for whatever agenda is at hand, right? But we need to do that too. We need to claim our histories and use our histories in order to answer back, really. So all I'm really doing is trying to problematize official narratives and to answer back and make a problem. I may or may not help with the solution, but by making a problem, to me, that is a step towards something. Yeah.
Let's talk a bit more on this idea of troublemaking, since both of you landed on this also in discussing about your respective practice. Let's hope we don't get into trouble.
Yeah.
But there is this, so, you know, there is a great sense of responsibility and care that seems to inform this intention of making trouble. And at times, I suppose your work as well, in a way, speak out of hand, you know. And I'm very curious, how do you navigate that reception, you know, either by the public or institution, or just the idea that there is an intention to sort of like open up the space for the discussion of that history that has not been discussed, and yet at the same time there is the tiredness, there is the anger and the frustration, and this manifests in your work. So I'd like to kind of talk a bit about that reception. How do you find your troublemaking ways, you know, reach out to that wider audience? Do they answer back? Do they speak with you? Do you find a wider, you know, tribe, so to speak?
I'm very short, but I think there's a lot of people who are afraid of me, and I don't know why. But it's because I speak a truth, and they find that truth very hard to come to terms with. But as I've gotten older, I realise that's in the nature of my people. So when Europeans try to colonise us, through the reading that I've done, we put up a 20-year resistance. That's longer than the Afghanistan war that just happened, right? So I love to analyse things, and I say to myself, I come from a line of fighters, and that's who I am. That's in my blood. And so I operate in two spaces, on the margins and in the mainstream. And I'm very strategic about what I do. And I also like to outsmart the authorities. So I do that all the time. And I think I'm one jump ahead. I'm one jump ahead because they're too slow, they're lazy, they, you know, just can easily dismiss you through a label. And so, you know, I get asked a lot in Australia by non-Indigenous Australians, so what type of art do you make? You know, when I say I'm an Aboriginal, they will say, what type of art do you make? Expecting me to say dot painting, right? And I say, I make provocative art. And so a non-Indigenous woman did her PhD on me, Dr. Louise Martin Chu, and she asked me, what do you think I should call the biography? And I said, call it Provocateur. And so that was released last year. And I don't really care because we're on this planet for a short time. I've been afforded the opportunity of a voice because my forefathers weren't, because they've been silenced through the history writing. And I have to make every opportunity a winner. And I've been lucky to be afforded an education. And so that's how I view the world. Everything I do is a winner. I operate in a space that can be either that or that. And I speak from a place of cultural integrity, and no one will ever trip me up because that's how honest I am.
I ditto everything she said. I really ditto everything you said. I don't know how to add to that, but it's again, I just so appreciate hearing it out loud, because it is really hard to be true to your own path and to beat by your own drum, according to your own compass. My compass is Mount Kinabalu. I know exactly where I'm from. And to remain true to that. And in the art world, to remain true to that despite the market, despite those things about the art world. We're not talking even the political content, but the distractions of the art world, right? And to just say, no, I need that support from the art world because I live off art. It's all I do. I'm full-time. But at the same time, I'm always conscious that it's never about that. It's about this agenda of finding voice, of now that I'm over 50, you know, there's so much joy, I think, in being a woman over 50. I turn 51 next week, right? So I'm now over 50. And it's Ursula Le Guin's Crone, the old Crone written in like 1979 or something, about when we meet the aliens from outer space, who do we send as a representative? We send the old crone. We send the old woman because the old woman has been invisible. She's lived through everything. She's brought life. She's seen death, post-menopause. She's witnessed all pain, most of it, and all joy, most of it invisible. But she has understood humanity at a level that can represent humanity. And that just resonated so much with me, the old crone as superhero, right? And the old crone represents humanity because this invisible woman sees everything, right? And has experienced everything. So I don't know why I got to that. But the point of the matter is, having the confidence of having been around the block a couple of times and staying true to one's agenda and self takes a certain amount of bravery, a certain amount of arrogance, a certain amount of, I don't know what the word is, something really kind of gritty, like stubborn, like something without going into sort of dogmatic territory, something really grounding. It's not even fortitude. Fortitude suggests that, you know, you've got great energy or something, but sometimes it's not even about energy. It's this, okay, I'm working on this bamboo series. It's called the Tukad Kad sequence. It's with the inland Keningau Dusun community, of which my grandmother is Kadazan Dusun. And there's this weave, and it was another revelation moment. And it looks like a step. It's the most basic weave. Everyone, primary school kids learn there, right? And then as we're talking about it, I'm learning all the time, just by casual conversation as we're sitting there. And they said, that's called Tukad Kad, like steps, like stairs. That's the shape. And then they said, like Tukad Kad in your mouth, the roof of your mouth. It's like the shape of steps. And when you eat something too hot, too cold, too acidic, the roof of your mouth becomes, the step-like ridges becomes more pronounced. And then I thought, the mouth, then I understand what I'm doing. I'm the mouth. I'm between the deeply personal and public, what you take in, what you eat, what you take from the world, and then what you vomit out, or what you say out, or what you express out. And there's this between zone. And I think of what I'm doing is I'm at this trigger site between the too hot to cold, between personal and public, and my grandmother's memory worms. You won't let me be, this agitation that makes me keep doing it because it just won't let me go. It's agitation. Yeah, I don't know the question either.
No, no, no.
Yeah.
I think you've been answering, the two of you have
Yeah.
been kind of answering the questions, and we don't have to have this resolve, like, straight linear line to the replies. I think what's interesting are all the kind of marginal materials that are coming to the fore, just by starting from both your works. So I do want to talk about this, maybe a kind of temporal sensibility that looks at history, that looks at the past, and yet it is actually incisively commenting about the present, or at least kind of summoning people to look at the present in a slightly different way, right? And that is very strong in both your works. Your sources looks directly at what has been left out, and what's not written enough, or what's been ignored, but you are addressing the present. And sort of just going back to picturing power, Ilan, you do so not just visually by sort of staging the photo montages of the archival images from Truppen Museum. You're also doing it textually through your long titles. I'm going to read one out, which is, so if you've seen Ilan's Picturing Power in Southeast Asia Gallery 4, there are 8 works in the series. We're showing 5, and one of it is of a classroom of students being taught by a European woman, and the title reads, "Wherein one claims the hearts and the minds of the innocent and gives them the knowledge that is to be learned." Fiona, you also work like with text. You don't just make images, you don't just make art objects, you write. So, you also write about all of these, the past in this particular present. So I want the two of you to maybe just share a bit more about, just working across that medium, those different medium, not just visually, but also textually, not just addressing the past, but also addressing that present. Yeah. Ilan, do you want to kind of say what is Picturing Power, sort of, who are you summoning in this work?
This is where I differ from First Nation countries. First Nation, to me, is Canada. The argument of First Nation, the terminology of First Nation is Canadian. A very, very different history. This is global north. There's the white countries with indigenous First Nation histories. In Southeast Asia, where we're from, here, I find that so difficult to translate. And Picturing Power was also addressing some of that, like First Nation versus Second Nation. If I was to try and honor the land of Kota Kinabalu, where I'm from, is it the sea people? Is it the land people? Who was there first? They ought to start a war between the land people and the sea people because they'd argue about, it's like this homogenized notion. To me, it's the word First Nation has colonialistic overtones that I really repel against. It's why, although I am indigenous, my grandmother is indigenous, I trace my kampung Nambazan back 6 generations to Uki Umbut and Diongoy. I never call myself an indigenous artist because the way the terminology is used puts me into a box. But I fight the fight that is the context and meaning that often is associated with those words. But I will not be censored in the sense of the census that gave us even words like dusun, of which my grandmother was categorized under the census. So these words become more of that use of describing and categorizing people without, in ways that I find unsatisfactory or directive, which I repel against. So you were asking me, I've forgotten.
So do you think, just picking up from
picturing
that,
power.
do you
Picturing
think,
power is actually about West Malaysia versus East Malaysia. It's about brown on brown colonialism. It's about how federal Malaysia learned colonial power, learned the violence of administration, learned the violence of the table, and then impose it on Sabah and Sarawak, the Borneo states. It's what will happen when Jakarta moves from Java to Borneo. The Javan cultures versus the Dayak cultures, when a dominant culture dictates over less dominant, or maybe in Sabah and Sarawak, we are dominant, but we have no voice. We have never had a film in the cinema, ever, in our language, in any of our 30-something languages. We've never had a feature film from Sabah in Malaysian cinema, right? There's no newspaper from Borneo, Malaysia, sold on the other side. Our education system comes from KL. We don't learn Bornean history, we learn West Malaysian history. All of this is what picturing power is really about. So these white Dutch colonialists are stand-ins, in a way, for what we have learned and imposed on our own people. It's brown on brown neo-colonialism. It's economic power. It's cultural power. Why I'm such a pain in the KL cultural landscape is I keep arguing against this domination of a homogenized Malaysian culture that doesn't even notice. We're not invisible because we don't, we're starting, it's starting. It's not that we're not invisible, we have a growing voice. But part of my I would not be on social media except for the need to be a pain in the ass person that exists, right? So I'm there for that reason. Otherwise, I don't have time for this. But I feel that I need to, because this is my subject. I'm talking about presence, right? So picturing power, it ends with some native guy, brown guy, looking through a theodolite like a surveyor who would survey the land in colonial times, at a bare-breasted native woman in a sarong who's framed as if she's in a window or a picture frame. And it's how we've learned ways of looking at ourselves. From a bare-breasted, nude woman, she's now a naked woman. Now we censor our old photographs. We can't handle tits, the ways of looking have been the ways of framing everything has been learned. Systems of power are learned and then imposed. So picturing power is recognizing that, and in a way it's twofold. It's disguised in a sense. Maybe also this is 2013, so maybe I wasn't 50 yet, so not quite as brave. So I had to disguise it via the Dutch, right? But actually I'm talking about East and West Malaysia. And the images are largely Javan, so it's not even Malaysian, it's Indonesian. But in my mind, as I'm making it, what I'm really doing is I'm talking about East-West Malaysia and how this imposition of power and administration, economic, neo-colonialistic, Petronas, the works, right?
Yeah. I want to get to one last point, and maybe, I'm wondering there might be some questions from the floor, but I do want to talk about maybe moving from the kind of artists, that we have spoken about, largely about your work and the reception of your work, to the different roles that you both play in your respective practices as well. Fiona, you lecture, Ilan, you have been working very closely as this maker, organizer extraordinaire. You work with your communities in Sabah, and in the recent years, as we're seeing from the images on the slide, you have been organizing and making quite collaboratively and extending that that artistic uh, um, fire to that community and getting them to work together. I want to talk about that aspect of that collaboration and community, how you extend from creating works from your lens, from your perspective, and then sort of expanding it into the people and the people in the proximity. So, can you maybe share a bit about, respectively, how do you sustain this collaborative spirit? In some way, it is a kind of activism or organizing, as well as your artwork or your writing, in this case, for you, Fiona.
I want to try and put my thinking and theory and concepts into practice. Is essentially what I'm doing now. So I can talk about the violence of admin, the violence of this hard patriarchal colonial table, but it's all very well to talk about it. How are you then, how am I going to, what's the alternative? How am I going to answer back? Because I'm always answering back, right? I'm argumentative. So then there's black and white photo here somewhere. I don't know if you saw it just now. And again, it's the archive actually. When I moved back to KK from KL 2016-ish. My studio got set up in 2017. This one. There's me on the left, my sister being lifted. There's my grandmother by the door, the middle face. When I went back to KK, and I always read photographs, yeah? I'm a photo reader rather than a photo maker. So I'm looking through family snapshots, and then I go, oh my God, yeah, my grandmother used to weave. And I'd forgotten. I'd absolutely forgotten. And so much so that I had to check with my dad, did Papa used to weave? Yeah, she did. Matt, yeah. What did she weave with? A bundusan, bumban, but mainly bundusan. I said, what's bundusan? I didn't even know the name of this. Bundusan to me is the name of a highway. It's a road name between my grandmother's kampong and Kota Kinabalu, right? I thought it was the name of a road. But the road is named after a reed that the people in that area used to weave with, including my grandmother. And then I couldn't even find the damn plant. Later on, it took me a year to find the plant and people who could weave that plant and process that plant and find the mats. And then I realized, oh, and then I discovered but I fell in love with the joy of coming home is you see things a little bit differently. I mean, I always go back. My family's in Sabah, always has been. But when I moved my studio there, I was reading and looking differently, and it was a gift. So then I started hearing and seeing our local philosophies in plain sight that I hadn't noticed before. So our marketplace, this problem of the homogenized indigenous person, we're so diverse, right? And you see that diversity at our local pre-colonial farmers market called the Tamu, where the hill people would meet the jungle people, would meet the river people, would meet the plains people, would meet the sea people, all with different produce, right? So if my people are plains people, we're rice growers, right? I grew up with rice fields. And then, so we have rice, but we don't have salt. We have got massive goiter problem in the inland community because there's not enough salt. So you need to go to the market to meet the sea people to buy salt or to exchange for salt. And the sea people need their rice. So the marketplace where you meet and every products are on these mats, right? Like my grandmother used to weave. You need and desire and want the other. It's not a tolerating of the other. It's not putting up with the other. It's I need you. I want you. And when we come together, it's for mutual benefit. And that's the original market. That's when people from different geographies and different produce come together, share the mat of the market in order that everyone benefits and everyone is healthier. So this was another revelation. So before the table, we had mats. Oh my God, it's in plain sight. And the table is the meja or the mesa. The name of the mat, there's 1,000 names for mats. Every community has a different name for mat. Even the same peoples from different kampongs have different names. And the mat contains objects, it's motives, it's language, it's multi-group generations, it's multilingual in that neighboring communities can read each other's visual language. So suddenly my world got boomed into this realization in plain sight. My grandmother was a weaver, the marketplace, all of this. If we, and the mat as architectural space, calling people to commune together. I'm currently making, or about to, October I'm going to start, this new work about when you open a box, that box in Malaysia, the Melayu, China, India, other, right? I've been other my entire life, right? Melayu, China, India. I think Singapore also has that kind of, yeah, you're all nodding, yeah, you understand. When you open the box, think of a cardboard box. When you open a box, you make a mat, right? Homeless people, you open the cardboard box, you make a mat. You sleep on the cardboard mat, right? When you share the mat and you remove yourself from your little ghetto of your little colonial census of this box, everything starts opening. And then you start having direct access to ancestral knowledge. In Malay, they say nenek moyang. Ancestral knowledge is gendered. It's female. It's nenek moyang. And to me, because my ancestral knowledge is via my grandmother, it is gendered. It is female, right? So all of this is what I'm now I don't need to, I'm less angry. I'm less fighting because I'm going to show you the way forward and you're going to learn from me. Because I have your answers. You're all floundering in your, want to keep your precious little box. And I'm just like, smash the box. When you sit in your little box, you're actually losing out on our local philosophies of how to exist and how to be as communities. And this became especially apparent during the COVID years and in the age of climate change. We need to work in our deep locals, and we need to, the solutions are right there. We just need to notice them in a way. So I've been on this quest to kind of relearn our local philosophies and how to deal with current issues via something so deeply familiar that is sometimes taken for granted.
Fiona, may I invite you to maybe also reflect on that? I know you earlier spoke about the work of your mother, Shirley Foley, who, then became quite central in the contribution of the dictionary. But you were also very active in the Bumali Aboriginal Arts Cooperative in Sydney. And now, of course, you teach. And so, maybe just share a bit about all these aspects of not just kind of like being an artist, but also a member of that community or that cooperative. Yeah.
I think it's similar. Like it's piecing all of these things together. So I'll start as a 5-year-old child, but be very quick. I remember sitting at the beach and looking across to Fraser Island, which is a part of our traditional country. Fraser Island, its traditional name is Gari. It's the largest sand island in the world. And I was speaking to my grandmother and I said to her, why aren't there any Giveed people living on the island? And Giveed in our language means Aboriginal. And she got very angry with me because she didn't really know how to answer the question. But it's alluding to the fact that from a young child, I have a very inquiring mind and I never got a satisfactory answer. And I would ask my mother as I was growing up the same sort of question. What happened to us? Why aren't we living on our island? And when I turned 50, 50 is a great age. I'm a bit more than 50 now, but not quite 60. I decided to challenge myself and enter and do a PhD. And I thought, what could the topic be about? And we have this legislation, it's got a very long title, called the Aboriginal Protection and Restriction of the Sale of Opium Act. And that curiosity as a child was still there. Why were the words Aboriginal and opium in that one title? What did opium have to do with Aboriginal people? So no one teaches this, of course, in Australia. And it was that quest to find out more. And through that quest to find out more, obviously, when you do a PhD, you have to write. And part of that was a 30,000-word thesis, and then it became a publication. Lucky for me, the book won an award last year, and also it's sold out the first print run, 1,500 in the print run. And so the book is piecing all of these bits of information together, this, that, that no non-Indigenous person is capable of, because they haven't necessarily grown up in the culture. And it's people who grow up in the culture that can pull all these strands together. So in that publication, I was able to pull all these strands of information together. And they used Fraser Island, that book there, Bagimba Creek Mission, the first Aboriginal experiment, was the second book I published last year, independently, was the mission they set up on the island to bring all of the opium-affected Aboriginal people and dump them on a really terrible part of the island where it's sandfly infested, mosquito infested, poor sanitation, couldn't grow any crops because it's a sandy soil. People were half starved there. There were 70 deaths. The state government tried to run it but never put enough funds into it, and then they handed it over to the Anglican Church in 1900. And they closed it in 1904. When they closed it, they took all of the Aboriginal people there, about 170, up to Yarrabah, which is near Cairns. And people like my family were gainfully employed in the timber industry or the fishing industry, remained behind on the mainland, so we didn't have to undergo that removal. So this is some of the complexity of race relations in Queensland, and a part of that complexity were three main races: Europeans, white Australians, the Chinese who came to Queensland in 1848, so there's a long history of Chinese immigrants who were principally market farmers, importers, exporters, business people, and then came in another wave with the gold rushes in Queensland. And then Aboriginal people. And what the white people were afraid of was the alliance happening with the Chinese men and Aboriginal women, because most of the Chinese men who came out didn't come with their women folk, and they were marrying Aboriginal women. That alliance was very strong because it allowed the women an economic certainty that their children would be fed, housed and looked after through the businesses that the Chinese men were operating. So they amended the legislation in 1901 and made it illegal for Chinese men to intermarry or to marry Aboriginal women. You couldn't do that. So the legislation was really race-based. And the children from those offspring, from those marriages, were all taken away from their parents by the state in 1901. Now, this is the history that's not talked about in Australia or Queensland, and it goes to race and complexity and how people were governed. And that legislation also allowed the state to come in and remove Aboriginal people from this part of the state, let's say out west, to south, to east, to north. And then they were, in the 1870s, they were talking about the islands of Queensland as places to relocate Aboriginal prisoners even before any crime had taken place. So, there are always strategies in place how to subjugate a people. And this is the research that I've been working on. And I knew as a child something was really off. But I couldn't quite get there. And it was only through the reading that I did by a number of historians in my 20s and 30s and 40s was I able to piece this larger jigsaw puzzle together and put it in a narrative where it was digestible to an audience that was nationwide. So the publication has now sold out. It's going to go into a second print run. And otherwise, I would be speaking about this forever and a day at, events like this. And I just wanted to have another way of putting it out there apart from being physically invited to speak.
Fiona, my grandfather, who's from Wei Highway, northern China, was an opium addict. He was British indentured labor, brought to North Borneo, and he was an opium addict by the British. So again, you have resonance of how to control the labor within the colonial times.
Okay. As much as this conversation seemed to have just begun, haven't even touched the surface. I'm very aware of what we have left for this discussion. So I would actually like to maybe spend the next 20 minutes and allow people to maybe ask some questions if you have any. No? Oh, then it gives us another 20 minutes to reflect more on this discussion. No questions to either Fiona or Ilan? Someone's tapping the mic.
Fiona, when you grew up, did you grow up in your own land? And did you continue living there?
I was born on country, which is Bachelor country, in Maryborough Hospital. And I lived there until my father's non-Indigenous, so I come from mixed parentage. And my father experienced a lot of racism being married to an Aboriginal woman, so they decided to move the family, relocate to Mount Isa, to a mining town, because it was much more cosmopolitan. There were a lot more interracial marriages, just say white Australians and Filipino women, and they were more accepting of the marriage. But then, because education was very important for my mother, that all of us children received an education, they decided to relocate to Hornsby in Sydney, and we were all educated in Sydney, but we'd have holidays back on Fraser Island.
Okay, so I guess, hi, I'm Sharon. I'm just going to ask this question, and it may not be put very elegantly, but just wondering, a lot of, your history, the history of what you've done, the research, the artwork that you do is just so full of activism in that sense. Do you find that when you're operating in the art world and your art is appreciated, people seeing it, do you find that it sort of stays in the art world and is not really impacting policies, for instance? How do you deal with that?
Who are you asking? Both of us?
Both of you,
Both
yeah.
of you can.
I think having my Tika Gaga downstairs at NGS has an impact on the thinking of the curators of one of the most important art institutions in the Southeast Asia region, writing our art canon. How big is that role? I mean, think about that as power, yeah? NGS has incredible power. So to me, with a collection that largely starts with colonial history, and the colonial view, I think of it as a coup that I have my tika gaga in the foyer before you buy a ticket, right? Because I always want to like kachao, right? That's what I do. So I try really hard to make other presence around, so that you know that there's some. I want to add to the niggling feeling that you have to remember that that you don't have everything, that there's many truths, there's many stories. Where are we located? Who are our people? Who are our audiences, right? And as institutions, or in terms of policy, to be constantly raising that. In terms of the communities themselves, this is a really, this to me is my main focus. In a way, the institutions and the policy level, I know that I'm, in a way, being watched for the work that I do. And I also do work on a board of directors of an NGO called Forever Sabah that does work with environmental and conservation issues. And with so, you know, I have very legitimate that side of myself, right? But at the same time, for me, how the hell do you make communities value themselves? How do you do that? How do you give empowerment back to people who feel that they have no power? And that's my interest. In a way, the policy level, they will need to get up to speed, because it's not just me doing this. It's a global thing because of climate change, because of all these things. How do we, the NGO that I'm with talks a lot about circular economies versus extractive capitalist economies, right? So there's that level doing their thing, right? But for me, how do I make communities see how their knowledge is valuable, and that it's something that needs to be nurtured? Somewhere here you would have seen pictures of young kids who helped me make the Tika Major mats. They roll their eyes, they're not interested. They, you know, like all kids, they want to play on the phones. But they get paid to do this, right? And they're learning from their mums, right? I got child labor. Taught by, under the supervisions of their mothers. So I think the mum says, oh, it's okay. That's right. So Balai Bikin, community-owned, community-run, community everything. There's a picture of 5 of us. Oh, those are the kids. They're Rosia's daughter, is Dayang. That's the teachers. Oh, this is the inland community. The talk about the tables. Initially, when I was working on the tables to juxtapose that series is called Tika Major, which we just showed at Unlimited at Art Basel, which I just thought was another coup. You know, the art world gives me these gifts, right? And it's like, it's made by stateless people on the Celebisi bordering Sulu, and I'm freaking showing it at Basel. I just love it, right? It's like, and then, thank you very much, it's sold. Take the money, and then we're going to make Balai Bikin, and we're going to have all this fun, right? Oh, that's the joy of being an artist, right? But these are the leaders of Balai Bikin. So Kak Rosiana Tudung, she's Malaysian, lives on the island. Kinohong, Sana, and Budi, they're stateless. They live in the water village. So we have 5 leaders. And myself, I'm also a leader. So these 5 women are going to be the leaders of this making hall. So beyond the artwork and art world, all of this other stuff is happening that the art world, actually very, very few people know about all this other stuff. And that's fine, because it's not for you, right? It's for us. It's for our local politics for us, both the sea community and the land community. Tanah, land, air, water, sea. Tanah, I mean compounded word meaning homeland. It's for us to answer back to federal, which is what we call KL. KL never uses the word federal. Sabah and Sarawak use it on a daily basis. When we say federal, we mean Putrajaya or KL. So when are you flying back to federal? Tomorrow lah. You know. yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah.
Fiona, any last reflections on that? Maybe a different sort of circulation because it's on a book level. Do you have a next book project coming up? Yeah,
If I'm successful in a grant I've put in, I won't find out till November. It's a 3-year project. I'll be working, filming 14 different communities and their response to memorials that they've put up themselves in relation to frontier massacre sites on their country. And that will be, a book will come out of that and 14 short films. So that's working with a lot of different countries, 5 different states in Australia.
Wow. I don't see any hands raised. So there is, okay. Yeah, maybe one last question. Yeah.
Actually, it's interesting because a lot of the works upstairs, actually they're not upstairs, they're on this floor, are if the Aboriginal communities. There were women making cooperative efforts to create art, and so I don't know whether you want to comment about how that is a positive thing or it makes them, I don't know, beholden to a market, or because I think one of the points here is that, for at least from Elon's practice, that this is an empowering thing. So would you say that it's similarly empowering for the Aboriginal communities, and because it's been going on for a long time, obviously?
From the early 70s, the Papunya art movement, which was community driven. And then I was a part of a wave of artists through Bamali Aboriginal Artists Cooperative, where we were agitating for recognition of Sydney-based or city-based artists in Sydney. And that took a lot of convincing of people in art institutions that we were just as legitimate as people making art from Arnhem Land or Central Australia or Western Australia. So we had to fight for that space. Now it's quite commonly accepted, and a part of that acceptance is that there are Indigenous curators in all state galleries in Australia. It's unfortunate that all of those young Indigenous curators aren't aware that there was a history of having to fight for that recognition, so they're oblivious to that. God bless them. And there are large communities with active Aboriginal female painters, and that's been going on for quite some time. A lot of respect for Indigenous women artists, but even if you're based in the city or remote areas or rural areas. So a lot of barriers have been broken down in the last 30 years in the Australian art world, and so that continues to happen. But it was, in the beginning, it was a bit of a hard fight in the 80s.
Okay, thanks for that. Thank you, Ilan, and thank you, Fiona, again for kind of sharing quite candidly, actually, a lot of these stories that we don't usually get to see surfaced when you're just visiting an exhibition or just reading an artwork label. So I'm really happy to have spent this afternoon kind of looking at all the other aspects of your practice as an artist, but also as an organizer, as a teacher, and all of that. So with that, I'd like to invite everyone to give the two of them a round of applause. And a sort of gentle reminder that if you have visited the main exhibition but haven't yet had the opportunity to go to the Southeast Asia Gallery 1, 3, 6, 12 and 14, and 14 is where Fiona Foley's Bachala Woman and Ilan's Picturing Power series works are, please do that. Thank you a lot for spending your afternoon with us. Yeah. Have a lovely weekend.